November 24, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The mission briefing should have been routine. Major Robert Morgan stood before his crew in the sweltering Pacific heat, watching their faces as he explained the target, the Nakajima aircraft plant in Tokyo. 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses would fly that day, their Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines already warm and rumbling across the coral runway. It was supposed to be precision bombing at its finest. But what Morgan didn't tell them, what he couldn't tell them because he didn't yet understand it himself, was that they were about to encounter something that would haunt the Allied bombing campaign for months to come. Something invisible, something that would kill more effectively than any Japanese fighter. The B-29s lifted off at dawn, climbing to their operational altitude of 30,000 feet. At that height, the air was thin and cold, the temperature dropping to 60 degrees below zero. The crews wore heated suits and oxygen masks, their breath fogging the plexiglass windows as the bombers droned westward across the Pacific. Morgan's aircraft, dubbed Dauntless Dotty, carried 12 men and 6 tons of incendiary bombs. The flight should have taken 14 hours round trip. They had trained for this. They had prepared for flak, for fighters, for mechanical failures. They had not prepared for what waited above Japan. 3 hours into the flight, Bombardier Lieutenant James Carlson noticed something wrong. The ground below was moving too fast, far too fast. He checked his instruments twice, certain they were malfunctioning. The airspeed indicator read 220 miles per hour, normal cruising speed for a B-29, but his calculations showed they were covering ground at nearly 400 miles per hour. It was impossible. Morgan was called forward. He stared at the readings, then at the ocean racing beneath them like a river in flood. The other aircraft in the formation were drifting, struggling to hold position, their pilots fighting controls that seemed to have minds of their own. Then they crossed the Japanese coast, and everything fell apart. The wind hit them like a physical wall, a screaming, invisible force that tore through the formation with savage intensity. B-29 scattered across the sky, some blown miles off course in seconds. Pilots wrestled their yokes with both hands as wind speeds exceeded 200 miles per hour, faster than any weather system they had ever encountered. This wasn't a storm. There were no clouds, no rain, no lightning, just wind. Pure, relentless, incomprehensible wind that seemed to defy every law of nature they understood. Morgan watched in horror as bombers ahead of him were hurled sideways, their formations disintegrating. Radio chatter exploded with confusion and fear. "I can't hold position. Wind's pushing us backwards. We're burning fuel twice as fast." The entire strike force was being torn apart by something they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't fight. Some aircraft were pushed so far off course they would never reach Tokyo. Others found themselves flying backwards relative to the ground despite their engines roaring at full power, their propellers clawing uselessly at air, moving faster than they could fly. When they finally reached Tokyo, the bombing was a disaster. The wind scattered their bombs across 40 square miles of city, most falling harmlessly in the bay or countryside. The Nakajima plant remained untouched. Morgan's bombardier released his payload, but even as the bombs fell, the wind caught them, carrying them away like leaves in a gale. Below, Japanese civilians watched in confusion as American bombs drifted slowly eastward before finally falling to earth miles from any military target. The most powerful bomber in the world had been rendered nearly useless by wind. The flight back was worse. Fighting headwinds that sometimes exceeded 250 miles per hour, the B-29s crawled towards Saipan, their fuel gauges dropping at catastrophic rates. Right engines, already prone to overheating, began to fail under the strain of maximum power. One by one, bombers ditched in the Pacific, their crews scrambling into life rafts as the mighty Superfortresses disappeared beneath the waves. Morgan's fuel warning light came on an hour from base. He shut down 2 engines to conserve fuel, the aircraft shuddering as it descended through 30,000 feet. They landed with fumes in their tanks. 11 aircraft never made it back. Not one had been shot down by enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. They had been destroyed by wind, by something meteorologists would later call the jet stream, a river of air circling the globe at altitudes where bombers flew, moving at speeds that made conventional bombing impossible. But that night, standing on the runway at Saipan, Morgan knew only one thing with absolute certainty. They had discovered a weapon more powerful than anything Japan possessed, and they had no idea how to fight it.
December 3, 1944, 20th Air Force Headquarters, Guam. The meteorologists couldn't explain it. Colonel William Blanchard stood in the briefing room, watching them point at weather maps covered in swirling lines that looked more like abstract art than science. They called it the jet stream, a phenomenon theorized before the war but never encountered at this scale. Dr. Thomas Rossby, borrowed from MIT, tried to explain it in terms Blanchard could understand. At certain latitudes, particularly over Japan during winter, rivers of wind formed in the upper atmosphere, moving at speeds that sometimes exceeded 300 miles per hour. The bombers were trying to fly through a horizontal hurricane that existed in clear sky. But Blanchard didn't care about the science. He cared about results. In 10 days of operations, the 20th Air Force had lost 37 B-29s to operational causes, fuel exhaustion, engine failure, crashes, without inflicting significant damage on Japan. The jet stream was protecting Japan more effectively than their entire air defense network. General Curtis LeMay, newly appointed to command the bomber offensive, had given Blanchard 2 weeks to solve the problem. If they couldn't, the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan would be suspended indefinitely. The war in the Pacific depended on breaking Japan's industrial capacity, and Japan's industrial capacity was protected by wind. The solution, when it came, was radical. Captain Howard Jarrow, a navigator who had flown the November 24th mission, proposed the impossible: fly lower, much lower. The jet stream existed primarily between 25,000 and 40,000 feet. Below 15,000 feet, the winds were manageable. But flying at 15,000 feet meant flying directly into the range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns, where the flak was thickest and deadliest. It meant exposing the bombers to more enemy fighters. It meant higher casualties. But it also meant they could actually hit their targets. LeMay listened to the proposal in silence. Then he made a decision that would define the air war against Japan. They would fly low. They would fly at night, and they would switch from high-explosive bombs to incendiaries. If precision bombing was impossible, they would burn Japan's cities to the ground. The jet stream had forced them to change their entire strategy. In trying to protect Japan, the wind had sealed its fate. March 9, 1945, Tokyo. Morgan's B-29 descended through 10,000 feet in darkness, the city sprawling beneath them like a map of lights. 334 Superfortresses flew that night, each carrying 7 tons of M69 incendiary bombs. The jet stream still howled 30,000 feet above them, but down here, at 7,000 feet, the air was calm. Morgan could see other bombers around him, their formations tight and precise. They had learned to work beneath the wind. The Pathfinders dropped their markers first, brilliant crosses of fire that lit the target area. Then the main force followed, and Tokyo began to burn. The incendiaries fell like rain, each bomb cluster splitting into 47 smaller bomblets that scattered across wooden buildings and narrow streets. Within minutes, the fires merged into a conflagration that created its own wind, a firestorm that sucked oxygen from the air and generated updrafts so powerful they threw B-29s hundreds of feet upward like toys. Morgan's aircraft bucked and shuddered as it passed over the inferno. The temperature inside the bomber spiked. The smell of burning, wood, paper, flesh seeped through the pressurization system. Below, he could see people running through streets turned into tunnels of flame. The canals boiled. The firestorm created winds at ground level that exceeded those in the jet stream they had learned to avoid. 100,000 people would die that night, more than any other single air raid in history. The mission was a tactical success. They had destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo's industrial heart. But as Morgan climbed back to altitude, heading east toward Saipan with his bomb bay empty, he felt no triumph. They had solved the problem of the jet stream by creating something worse, a new kind of warfare where entire cities burned, and the distinction between military and civilian targets disappeared in the flames. The jet stream still flowed above them, invisible and indifferent. It had forced them to change. It had pushed them lower, closer to the people they were bombing, close enough to see the faces and smell the smoke and understand the true cost of what they were doing. In trying to defeat the wind, they had become something they never intended to be. As Dauntless Dotty crossed back over the Pacific, Morgan looked up through the cockpit window at the stars above them. Somewhere up there, the jet stream continued its endless circuit around the globe, a river of wind that would still be flowing long after this war ended, long after everyone who flew through it was gone. They had learned to fight beneath it, but they would never forget what it had taught them. That sometimes the most powerful forces aren't the ones you can see or shoot or bomb. Sometimes they're just wind, and sometimes in trying to conquer them, you become the storm yourself.